Please welcome Chris Bombardier.
That was my cue. I looked out over the audience. I had already climbed 4 of the tallest mountains on 4 continents: Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, Elbrus, and Denali. All 4 had brought different challenges. But this? Public speaking? For folks who know me well, they know that one of the most terrifying things possible to me is being the center of attention. I am very insecure most of the time, so I am definitely not a fan of public speaking. And when I'm put on the spot, in many instances, I just don't know what to say or what to share. But the crowd was waiting, and I had to deliver. This was my first public speaking gig about climbing the 7 summits with hemophilia. It was at a conference called Nacho, and I was going to be talking about my most recent climb, Denali. So I cleared my throat, and I started telling the story of my climb. This had been a particularly difficult climb. Unlike the Kilimanjaro climb, we hadn't been able to hire porters. This meant carrying all of my gear myself, over 50 pounds of it. I was also still recovering from an injury I got while downhill mountain biking, basically riding down a steep hill as fast as possible and trying not to crash. I failed not to crash. As I went through my presentation, showing the pictures of what the mountain looked like, showing its size, its scale, the difficulty of climbing it, I think it was eye-opening for people. Of those 4 mountains I'd climbed, many had heard of Kilimanjaro and knew how high that peak was, but it was nothing compared to Denali. And watching a presentation given by a person who climbed those mountains, a person with hemophilia, people finally began to understand why having a person with hemophilia in these spaces was incredible. This was a turning point in my journey to climb the 7 summits. Yes, climbing the first 4 mountains had gotten attention, but it was actually going to a conference and telling people about it that made it sink in. More eyes were upon me. But another experience shortly after my presentation really made it sink in. It was the first time someone came up to me and said my story was so inspiring, they were excited to share it with their kids. I was shocked in a way. I knew the climbs were cool. I just didn't know how impactful they might be to someone else. Slowly, as I did more and more climbs and shared my story more times, this experience began to occur more often. It was still overwhelming, but I was getting more accustomed to what it meant to be well known in the community, and it felt strange. I loved climbing mountains and sharing my story. I thought I might become a role model in some way through this, but I had no clue what that really meant. Those few experiences did not prepare me for what was to come. As I prepared for Everest, I knew this would garner much more attention. My name is Chris Bombardier, and I'm a mountaineer with hemophilia. From 2011 to 2018, I successfully climbed the 7 summits, the tallest mountain on each of the 7 continents. Since then, I've become the executive director of Save One Life. As a role model and a leader in the global hemophilia community, I've learned a lot since I climbed the 7 summits. It caused me to rethink my ideas about leadership and success, and to re-examine myself in the process. This is the final summit, Season 4, Reevaluating Success. This week, we're telling you the story of how I climbed the 7 summits. A story that sounds much different now that I'm older, and hopefully wiser. It's a story about setting a goal and achieving it, and what that means.
This next segment is brought to you by Genentech. There's a new short film out that's dedicated to moms who care for their sons with hemophilia A. It's an honest and visually striking journey about a mother going through the emotional whirlwind of raising a son with hemophilia A. This story is inspired by thousands of real moms and serves as a thank you for all that they do to make the hemophilia A caregiver community a place of love and resilience. Visit www.hemashort.com to watch the short film.
I'll come back to my mountain climbing story at the end of this episode. But spoiler, I did indeed climb Everest. But that speech I gave at the Nacho conference was another turning point in my life. I had climbed challenging mountains before, and I would climb even more challenging mountains still. For the first time, I really started to feel like my goal of climbing the 7 summits as a way to inspire the world really was starting to have an effect. I hadn't necessarily started with the goal of becoming a role model, but now I was becoming one. And with a few years of distance from that point, I've learned some things about being a role model and a leader. This is a great time to introduce our 4th guest for Season 4 of this podcast.
My name is Ryan Warner. I'm a consulting psychologist and I'm passionate about looking at the intersection between workplace inclusion, leadership development, and also workplace well-being. I started my career as a military psychologist, active duty with the United States Air Force. And during my time there, I was the director of psychological health. So it was my job to promote the psychological well-being of over 20,000 individuals and military members on the military installation. I started my consulting company, RC Warner Consulting, in 2020. And fast forward, I've been out of the military for a number of years now. And our company has worked on 6 continents globally, trained over 12,000 employees within Fortune 500 companies, local, state, and federal government entities as well. In the work that I do, I work with a lot of athletes. In the military, I work with pilots. I work with pararescue jumpers. I work with generals and colonels and very high-ranking individuals. In the executive coaching that I do, I work a lot with the United Nations and work with country leaders. And in these high-stakes type of high-stress roles, everyone always wants to get to that next level, right? Oftentimes, those in these very C-suite type of roles, they may feel that they're there to support everyone else and they prioritize themselves less. What do we hear when we go into an airplane and they say, if something happens, you put the oxygen mask on yourself first, and then you put the oxygen mask on the person next to you. However, oftentimes in my experience, I've seen leaders say, yeah, I want to make sure my team and those who report to me are taken care of. But then the most stressed out individuals may actually be those leaders in those roles based on the different pressures that they experience.
Dr. Warner has a lot more to say about leadership and mental health, and we'll come back to him in future episodes. But when we were planning a podcast about defining my role in the bleeding disorder community, one of the first people I wanted to talk to was Patrick James Lynch. He's the founder of Bleed Limited, and he directed my documentary. As someone with hemophilia A, he also has a lot to say about this subject.
You obviously have become a pretty significant role model in the bleeding disorder community. And I feel like you and I are in the same boat a little bit with that. I don't know if that was really your intention when you started Stop the Bleeding. How has that kind of evolved over time, and how has it made you feel to step into that role in this community?
I may have shared this with you before, Chris, and with listeners before, but I'll share it again. When I was first pitching Stop the Bleeding, I was with Linda Mugford at the Hemophilia Association of New York. So this is back in 2011. And she's helping me learn about grants and how things work. And I remember saying to her in the flow of conversation, and keep in mind at this point, nobody knows me from Adam or Eve. I'm not a known figure in the community. But I said, if I'm successful with this Stop the Bleeding thing, I'm putting myself in a position to potentially be the most recognized person with hemophilia in the world. And she looked at me as though the thought had already crossed her mind at some point, because out of the holster, she said, "Are you ready for that?" And I said, honestly, I don't know what that means, but I believe in this project. I believe in why I'm doing it. And so I have to have faith that if that leads to something unexpected, that's okay, and that I'll figure it out. And fast forward 14 years, I've tried to figure it out. I have always been a little bit uncomfortable with leadership, with influence. I'm even more uncomfortable when other people frame me or talk about me as a leader or influencer. But I also try not to quibble over the words, because another community member and a fellow blood brother of ours, Glenn Pierce, said to me once, leadership is part of choice and part chosen. You ultimately have to decide to say yes to it, but you don't decide if all the heads in the room turn to you in a moment of uncertainty. You don't decide who sees something you wrote and takes that into their next appointment with their doctor or their partner or whomever. Like, influence and leadership is part of choice, but it is part chosen. And that kind of helped me accept, okay, the part of it that I don't choose, that makes it okay for me to accept. Other people are deciding this is a role, and it's not about giving away agency, but it's about leaning into what is happening and saying, okay, I can serve this role so long as I'm always doing it within my own sense of authenticity, integrity, kindness, humanity. If so, if other people then want to say, hey, that's a leader, that's leadership, that guy's influential, okay, it's really not up to me to decide what my impact is. It's up to me to operate the way I want to operate. I've accepted it, but honestly, I'm still uncomfortable with it. And I think that's okay.
Yeah, I feel very uncomfortable with it as well.
Like you heard in my interview with Patrick, I'm still not quite comfortable as a role model and leader in the bleeding disorder community. I'm not sure it's something you ever fully get comfortable with. Another person I spoke to was Joanna Bakiro. Like me, Joanna has a bleeding disorder. She also overcame breast cancer and wrote a book on the subject. I asked Joanna about that experience.
To me, it was a really humbling experience writing my book because I thought I'm taking a big risk. I don't know how people are going to react to this. I don't know if people are going to treat me differently. I don't know if people are going to judge me or put me a stereotype of, okay, this is how you are going to be seen now. But it's what I felt in my heart that I needed to do. And so when I wrote my book, I didn't have money to publicize it. So I did a Kickstarter. And in my Kickstarter, I talked about what it was. And it was unbelievable, the positive response that I got of everybody donating money for me to publicize the book. At that point, I was like, oh, so it's actually a good thing. And after that, I started talking about it more openly. I was like 32 years old. Like I was older when I did this. So I lived for a long time. I lived a double life.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of people will connect with that and have similar experiences. While you were writing your book, did you look back at it and appreciate everything that you've overcome and all the challenges you faced, and you came out on top, I would say? Do you have an appreciation for all that you accomplished and were able to do with afibronegenemia and then breast cancer on top of that?
So, it's interesting. Your question is very interesting because I think that going through, and maybe you can relate to this, Chris, like going through having a bleeding disorder, and when you overcome a bleed, you feel like that's like part of what you have to do. You think, I just don't have another option. I just do it. And I just keep going and keep going. So to me, my life was not anything extraordinary. I was just doing what I needed to do to overcome a challenge, and then the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. When people started reading my book and knowing my story, they're like, oh, wow, it's such an amazing story what you've done. But to me, I never felt like it was like that going through it. I never was like, oh, I'm having resilience and I'm going through. No, it was more of, okay, you take this bleed, you understand, you solve the problem, and you move on to the next thing. It was more like getting the reaction from other people because, again, there's people that are also getting over other type of challenges. To me, it didn't feel that special, but what I feel like to me has been very touching is how much it has helped others in the way that they see similarities on overcoming challenges, not just bleeding disorders, but any other challenge. So I think that giving the reinforcement to other people of, you know what, you can do it. If I was able to do it with a bleeding disorder, you can do it in other ways with other challenges.
In Joanna's case, one of those other challenges was giving a TED Talk about resilience. We'll come back to her TED Talk next week because her tips are the sort of thing that we could all use in our lives. But for now, let's come back to where we left things at the top of this episode, with me embarking on an attempt to climb Mount Everest and become the first person with hemophilia to do so. Spoiler, but yes, I did indeed climb Mount Everest. And yes, I went on to climb Mount Vinson in Antarctica to complete the 7 summits. But when I came back from Everest and attended my first large hemophilia meeting, everything seemed to have changed. I noticed while walking in the halls, people would point and whisper. Being insecure, I worried my fly was open, or my hair was super messy, or I had a booger hanging out of my nose. But then I started to understand that folks were looking and pointing because they understood what I had just accomplished. They were excited to see me. It's hard to understand that people would think that much of me. I knew what I had accomplished was very cool, but I didn't feel like I had anything special in me. I looked up to so many other people that I thought were special, but I didn't quite know how to react when people thought I was special in some way. One specific moment brought to light what the meaning of being in that position meant. It was when a mom brought her son over to me to take a picture. I think he was around 10 or 11 years old and also had hemophilia. She was worried about him, but seeing me still be able to climb mountains was really encouraging for her family. She was so excited that her son had someone to look up to like me. That was on the first day of the conference, and it only continued to happen more and more frequently. I was tremendously honored to get to meet these folks and hear their stories and challenges, but I began to worry that I couldn't live up to their expectations. I'm flawed, not special. I began to feel like a fraud. Now I started to worry that I would just disappoint everyone. There was one session during the conference that I still think about today. A woman in the audience raised her hand and reminded me that so many people with hemophilia never had or never will have the opportunity that I had. It felt like a crushing weight landed. I had always felt like I was climbing mountains, not just for me, but for all those folks too. I did feel fortunate, so fortunate that I was able to do that. But the impact of that weight slowly expanded from there. I couldn't shake that feeling of responsibility. As we made our documentary, we made sure to highlight many of the people we met in Nepal, people with hemophilia and other bleeding disorders, for whom it would have been impossible to climb Everest. As I began attending more meetings and the documentary premiered, I realized that the words I chose and how I shared my experiences on social media and even how I showed up in the public could have profound impacts. Every time I met someone, I understood that it was important. I wanted to be present for everything that they said, to hear their story, to remind them that they're not alone in this challenge. But I didn't expect the toll that it would take on myself. It feels lucky to be in that position. I feel honored to hear those stories. But it also is a draining experience, to have intense conversations all day. You won't want to say the wrong thing. You want to live up to every expectation that they had. You want to give good advice. I felt like I had to always say something profound and eloquent, but that's not really me. I'm a fairly simple person. I like to walk uphill, meet challenges physically and mentally, and that's about it. So how could I continue on in this community with that weight? How could I live up to that expectation? How could I not disappoint someone? And how do I continue to pursue my ultimate goal of caring for people? After I climbed Everest and Vinson, a new path opened for me. Next week, on the final summit, I become executive director of Save One Life. I had faced many challenges in life before, but nothing quite like the challenges to come.
The Final Summit is hosted by Chris Bombardier, written by Jim Rowley, edited by Greg Bernhard, produced by Keith Corderluck, and graphic support from Tony Mendoza. The Final Summit is produced by Bloodstream Media. For more information or to start a podcast of your own, visit bloodstreammedia.com.